To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second. And tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.
We're delighted to welcome you back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. It's our pleasure to present Diving Deep with Douglas Stuart, The Many Layers of Shuggie Bain. Douglas Stuart in conversation with Paul McVeigh. Glasgow-born Douglas Stuart's 2020 Booker Prize-winning debut novel, Shuggie Bain, evokes the essence of addiction, parenthood, courage and love. Following the bond between a son and his mother, fractured by alcoholism, poverty, aspiration and human misery, the novel graphes an intimate, devastating yet ultimately hopeful journey through their lives. Stuart began his career in fashion design before moving on to writing. His other work includes the short stories Found Wanting and The Englishman. In conversation with writer and playwright Paul McVeigh, Stuart unravels the thought and process behind bringing this heartbreaking story out into the world. Douglas Stuart was born and raised in Glasgow. After graduating from the Royal College of Art, he moved to New York, where he began a career in design. Shuggie Bain is his debut novel. It won the 2020 Booker Prize. Paul McVeigh's debut novel, The Good Son, won the Polari First Novel Prize and the Macrae Literary Award. His short stories have appeared on BBC Radio and Sky Arts, and he co-founded the London Short Story Festival. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, Diving Deep with Douglas Stuart, The Many Layers of Shuggie Bain. Douglas Stuart in conversation with Paul McVeigh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and it's lovely to meet you, Douglas.
Nice
How is it over in New York? How's it over there?
It's good. We're actually currently sitting in about 2 feet of snow, so I wish desperately that we were both in Jaipur for some nice weather.
Well, I'm very sorry we're both not there at the wonderful parties and the fantastic festival and the amazing people you meet, and but I do feel sorry that you're missing that this year. In this your year of winning the Booker. But I've no doubt you'll be winning more prizes, and you'll be in Jaipur in the future. And but I don't feel super sorry for you having won the Booker Prize, and everybody's talking about your book, and you've written this amazing book that will, I think, be talked about for many years to come. And I thought it would be really lovely to start this session with a short reading from you. I think hearing it in your accent just sort of transforms that written word. So I'd love to hear from you.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Yeah, definitely. This is actually where we meet our protagonist, or our heroine, Agnes, at the beginning of the story. She is living with her mother and father, or her mammy and her daddy, and they're living in the high-rise flats in the heart of Glasgow. Agnes has 3 children, and she's looking around, Paul, and sort of chafing at the smallness of her life. The women cackled without breaking their concentration on the cards. It was sweaty and close in the front room. Agnes watched her mammy, little Lizzie, carefully studying her hand, flanked by the bulk of Nan Flanagan on one side and Reenie Sweeney on the other. The women sat thigh to thigh and tore at the last scraps of a fish supper. They were moving coins and folding cards with greasy fingers. Anne-Marie Easton, the youngest amongst them, was concentrating on rolling mean-looking cigarettes of loose tobacco on her skirt. The women spilt their housekeeping money on the low tea table and were pushing 5 and 10 pence bets back and forward. It bored Agnes. There was a time before baggy cardigans and skinny husbands that she had led them all up to the dancing. As girls, they had clung to one another like a string of pearls and sang at the top of their voices all the way down Sucky Hall Street. They'd been underage, but Agnes, sure of herself even at 15, knew she would get them in. The doorman always saw her gleaming at the back of the line and beckoned her forward, and she pulled the other girls behind her like a chain gang. They held on to the belt of her coat and muttered protest, but Agnes just smiled her best smile for the doorman, the smile she kept for men, the same one she hid from her mother. She had loved to show off her smile back then. She got her teeth from her daddy's side, and the Campbell teeth had always been weak. They were a reason for humility in an otherwise handsome face. Her own adult teeth had come in small and crooked, and even when they were new, they'd never been white because of the smoking and her mammy's strong tea. At 15, she had begged Lizzie to let her have them all taken out. The discomfort of the false teeth was nothing when compared to the movie star smile she thought they must give her. Each new tooth was broad and even and as straight as Elizabeth Taylor's. Agnes sucked at her porcelain. Now here they were, every Friday night, these same women playing cards in her mammy's front room. There was not a single drop of makeup between them. Nobody had much of a heart to sing anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Just hearing you mention Elizabeth Taylor there, and having read that recently in that section, reminded me of a story you told about your mum. Would you like to share that with everyone?
Yeah, definitely. Shuggie Bain is a work of fiction, and I think when you read the book, you'll understand that because it spans about 40 years in the history of the city, and it looks at many characters as they look back at Shuggie and Agnes. But I grew up, a lot of it is drawn from autobiographical details of my life, and I grew up as the queer son of a single mother, and my mum suffered with addiction her entire life and eventually succumbed to it when I was a young boy. But as the child of someone who's suffering with alcoholism, you learn an awful lot of tricks and strategies in order to hold them near you, to keep them safe, to hold them close. And one of the things I learned as a kid was my mother, who was this working class woman in Glasgow who felt incredibly insignificant in her own life. You know, she wasn't insignificant to me, but she felt in the time and the place very overlooked. And I learned as a kid, in order to hold her attention on me, if I pretended to write her memoirs, then she would focus on me and she wouldn't drink as heavily. And we wouldn't get very far most of the time, but I learned this at about 8 years old. And she always started dictating to me in the same way. And it was always for Elizabeth Taylor, who knows nothing about love. And it was only as an adult when I started to think back on this, and I thought how striking it was, first of all, that this working class woman would dare, for the opening lines of her book, she was going to tell Elizabeth Taylor how she knew nothing. But then, of course, Elizabeth Taylor was this icon, but she was also a woman who was difficult and challenging and forthright and strong. You know, she loved and lost, and she enjoyed to drink. And when you see her in movies, she's always a very demanding, powerful character. And my mother was the same way, but because of the context of the life that my mother lived in, 1980s Glasgow, 1970s Glasgow, under a patriarchy, she was condemned for it, whereas Elizabeth Taylor was celebrated for it. And I think that was what my mother was trying to convey across the pages.
I do think when I was writing about similar things in my and similarly autobiographically based or mined from, and I felt that I came to the conclusion that alcoholism and I think perhaps all addiction is the way that someone copes with not being the person they were supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered, do you think that resonated with Agnes? Do you think that explains partly what your mother was going through? And
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And what I wanted to show at the beginning of the book is Agnes Bain is a very promising character. You know, she's thick with love, she's thick with friends, she's surrounded by people who adore her mother and her father and her children. But as she starts to look around the world and she sees her very small dreams, they're quite humble dreams that she has. She wants things that should be quite accessible. She wants a home of her own to stop living with her mother and father. She wants, clothes for her children that she doesn't have to pay off over time, and just a little bit of glamour. And she wants to be adored by her husband. You know, we all want to be adored. And these things aren't going to come true for Agnes. And so she begins to sort of descend into her addiction because she's trying to escape that. She's very aware of what it is. And actually her middle child, Leek, sees that too for his mother. And towards the end of the book, is very aware that things aren't going to get better for Agnes when even Shuggie still believes that it can improve. But, you know, in thinking about my own mother and thinking about the time, I was forced to reflect on how I would feel about addiction and how I would feel about my life if under the patriarchy or under those conditions, I wasn't going to reach my potential. And so I can empathize very deeply with the character. I think I would also, I wonder if I would turn to addiction if I felt like my small dreams weren't going to come to anything.
And I think also there is the isolation that comes from being different, whether that difference is sexuality or your idea of yourself and what you might be capable of. And I think that really comes across for me with Agnes and Shuggie. Do you agree?
Yeah, I wonder if you felt this as well growing up in Belfast, Paul, but it was an incredibly narrow time and a narrow place in that time, growing up in the 70s and the 80s in Glasgow. And I don't mean in terms of just if you were queer or if you were outside of what the normal things were for society, but men and women had a very strict way of conforming, and any form of sort of self-expression or being outside of those norms was seen as almost as a threat and something quite risky. And so Agnes and Shuggie are both suffering within this in very different ways. Agnes is a very proud character. She has an enormous sense of self-worth and belief in herself, and a pride and a vanity, and she rejects shame consistently. But one of the ways she demonstrates this, she demonstrates it in many ways, but she, even no matter what's going on inside her life and the turmoil that's happening, she projects this very this beautiful aura to her. She's always immaculately done up between her hair and her makeup and the clothes that she chooses. And that is a very thin veneer of pride, because inside she's disintegrating in many ways. But then she also affects this thing where she rejects her regional accent and she talks in standard English as opposed to the Glaswegian brogue. And the people around her realize that she is someone very similar to her. She has the same socioeconomic situation, but she's affecting these airs and graces. And when we see people like that in society, we want to pull them down a little bit. We want to remind them of their place because it threatens us and it reflects back on us. But then Shuggie is isolated because he is an effeminate young boy. He's too young to have any sense of sexuality or sexual desire for most of the book, but he's just precocious and effeminate. And in a time when men had to be sort of hard drinking, hard working, hard loving, hard fighting, he doesn't fit into any of that. And so again, he's just looking for his sense of belonging.
Well, being gay in that respect is sort of the ultimate betrayal for a man, because you're saying, I reject my manliness and everything that you are teaching me about what a man means, and I'm choosing to be more feminine, which is your enemy at this time in this society, and the fact that, this is, men hate women. It's a misogynistic society, the way they behave. So the fact that he's choosing a side, as they see it, so he needs to be punished because he's rejecting them. And if you reject these men, their pride is so thin, you reject them, they're going to lash out and they're going to destroy you, which is what they're doing to women and then what they do then to young gay men.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, the homophobia he experiences is a cousin of misogyny, or it is sexism, because it's not wrapped in religious ideals in the book. It's wrapped in a sense of why would you want to be feminine, or why would you want to align with that? But Shuggie, funnily enough, isn't rejecting masculinity. He's trying desperately to access it. He just can't, because it's not his soul, it's not his spirit. And of course, his mother is the biggest thing in his universe. He is a minor moon that orbits her like she's a sun or a planet. But he tries throughout the book we see him try to walk normal like other boys do, to affect a more masculine stance. He is given a book halfway through the novel, which are historical football scores from the Premier League. And, they're pretty useless facts unless you're maybe a gambling man or someone who likes statistics. But Shuggie goes through them like the rosary, and he goes through them every single day and just tries to learn them off by heart, as if the absorption of these historical football scores would somehow make him more acceptable to the men around him. And he does this for about 10 years in the book, or maybe about 8 years. And it becomes part of him. So he's trying desperately to fit into the masculine culture.
He's trying to pass.
Trying to pass.
Yeah. And I think, that sort of part of it, I was thinking today, reflecting on Agnes, and I was thinking, that she she's sort of like a gay heroine, you know, that the sort of, you know, too beautiful for this world, and a little bit, you know, she's beautiful, she's stylish. She has the X factor that people look at her and they sort of resent the fact that she's different and has ideas and can carry it off as well. That you're not supposed to be able to do that coming from where we come from, you know. And again, that's another rejection. You're rejecting our working classness and our lot by wanting more. But there's this feeling that she is trying really hard to be herself, but that's not allowed, you know. I'm wondering, is Agnes really your mum? Is she a kind of gay heroine in this sort of Tennessee Williams style, or, you know?
Actually, you've kind of gotten to the heart of it. I can't say she's not my mum, because then it makes my mother seem less glamorous, but my mother was still a very ordinary woman in her time and her place. And Agnes, for me, was an ability to turn up the heat on the fiction. And she is almost quite camp. She has this ability to pierce people's notions with a single line and to sort of finish conversations. And she's really vibrant and glorious against the landscape. It's funny that I reference her with Elizabeth Taylor, because actually, the more I think about it, she's a lot more like the characters that Sophia Loren plays in movies. Because Elizabeth Taylor never played a working class woman for a start. She was always a very privileged, you know, waspy protagonist. But when you look at Sophia Loren, she was always a woman who was struggling in her community, whether it's the Neapolitan movies or the Roman movies she's in. But she's always glamorous. She's always sort of glorious against whatever's happening, the decay in the background, the buildings being torn down, the tough time that people are having around her. And you just can't stop looking at her. And so I was thinking a lot about Sophia Loren when I wrote the character of Agnes. Too big for the screen almost. But it also plays on notions. We think when we write about people in poverty or having a tough time that it's always grimy, or people don't care about how they look, or, you know, they suffer with what they've got. And I always actually knew the inverse of that. The less we had as a kid, the more my mother focused maniacally on how she looked and how we presented ourselves to the world. And it created this huge schism or big gap, meaning we were sometimes incredibly hungry, but my God, did we look great when we stepped over the front door. And that's control. And sometimes that was the only control a woman could have in that society, you know, was how we put ourselves together and what we projected.
And it's quite interesting because I was thinking, you know, that, you know, the idea of him performing his gender, you know, and then as a gay man, you are never truly allowed to evolve unbattered and unedited, or you know, unsculpted by others and their expectations. You know, I tried to explain to someone once about, you know, if I walked across the room in school, it was the way I walked, the way or if I ran, or if I spoke, or the way I picked something, the way I just stood, where I put my hand, or any of these things could get me beaten up, spat at, ridiculed, degraded. And that kind of pressure on someone is extraordinary, first of all. And I think that's why a lot of gay people end up as addicts themselves to cope with things that they've gone through. And I think that, you know, that your life becomes a performance and you're looking for a release from that. And I think Agnes, her life is a performance too. And I just keep seeing all these similarities between their situations, even though they're for different reasons. So.
Yeah. You're right, and the character of Shuggie has no ease. He's denied all the ease that children have because he's so aware of how he carries himself, and also between his sexuality and then his poverty and what Agnes is teaching him to project, even if they don't have. He's always forever turning a facet of himself that towards people that might not be there, and that was certainly something that I remember from my childhood, Paul. You know, there wasn't a single room I ever stepped into where I didn't feel bad for either being queer or being poor, or, you know, or maybe not being bright enough, or being born sort of in academic circles. And that followed me through my entire sort of youth and you know, as a young man, and it's formed everything about me. And that, you know, I just wanted to show that Shuggie has none of that ease. He doesn't ever get to be in a space without people saying, "What are you doing? Like, who are you?" And even people who love him, you know, his grandmother recognizes it in him and his brother recognizes it in him, and they adore him. They love the boots of him, but they still want him to sort of fit in and be normal or whatever that is.
Yeah. And I think, you know, for straight children, they have all of these examples around them. This is what I want to do if I want to become successful like my sister or my mum or my auntie, or if I want to do this job, or I want to marry this kind of person, or I want this kind of lifestyle. But you don't have those you don't have those trails of breadcrumbs to follow. The person who's hacked out the path before you, and so you're lost. And it's a very isolating experience, I think. But I wanted to just sort of touch on that and go back to your childhood, because you were just saying there about growing up working class and how it impacts upon you. And I'm doing a lot of work with working class writers at the minute in Ireland, and talking about, you know, the impact it had, and how one of the common things, for example, was that most writers who have now made it didn't make it until later in life. Mine first novel didn't until I was 45. I'm aware that it's coming to you later in life as well. And that's a direct, it's almost exactly the same for everyone. And I can see exactly why that is. And I just wondered, can you see that link between growing up working class and why your book's coming out now? Or?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a multi-layered sort of narrative in that. First of all, I didn't grow up with any books in the house. I wasn't a reader as a kid. And that wasn't something I spoke about, Paul, until I won the Booker, because it wasn't that unusual for the time or the place. I don't think any of my friends, especially male friends, young kids, had books at home. We weren't focused there. Didn't make us any less empathetic or creative or hinder our imaginations. We just didn't know that literature was a thing. And so I didn't really start reading, because children need an incredible amount of peace, both within themselves and in their environment. And I didn't have that until I was about 18, because I was bullied at school, because a lot of the kids that were coming to school every day were coming with some sense of deprivation. They were missing something, and so they were acting out when they got to school, and school was a riot because of that. And then also I was dealing with my mother's addiction. And so until those things all cleared up, I couldn't even focus on a page. And by then, you know, when I discover books, it's just too late for me to pursue English as a career. Also, the people around me had no concept of being able to say, oh yeah, this is something. There's no, like you say, there was no path. There was no connection that you can make a living by sitting around and reading and writing books all day. Like, there was nobody in my world that could say that to me. So instead, everyone says that I am a fashion designer, but actually, first and foremost, I'm a textile designer. I achieved a very pragmatic education that could have seen me running a textile manufacturing factory. It was only through some steps I took through my education that it then widened up into fashion, and fashion brought me to New York. But I was really sent in first and foremost to be very practical and make cloth, because what does Scotland make if not lots and lots of cloth and whiskey, but cloth? And so, you know, when I sat down in 2008, it was really about answering my own furloughed dreams and my own sort of shutting down my own insecurities and the huge chips on my shoulder. And who am I to think I can write a book, and who wants to read this book, and who wants to read about this family, when everything you read in books or in literature is focused on the middle class experience and the white middle class mainstream experience. And so I wrote it for 10 years and I kept it to myself. The only person I let read it actually was my husband, and that was enough. It was enough to write the book. But, you know, all those times I was battling with feelings of inferiority that stem from my childhood.
I think, you know, there's so much in the book. I mean, the many layers. I mean, and, you know, look, I have like about 255 questions, you know, so I just to come off of the top of my head. But I was, you know, I think that there's, I mean, it's a very brutal book at times, very unsettling. It's very visceral. I mean, you feel like you're there, and that's it. So it has that filmic quality as well. It's immersive. I think you understand why what people have reacted the way they have. You know, that you do feel like you dive right in at the deep end immediately, and you're just there, and you know, and it's but I was, again, my little reflections today, and I was thinking, but yet, with all of that said, and the setting is very harsh and brutal, and the family dynamic is all of that. So, but there's just this love there, you know, and that enables us to travel through on this journey. It's sort of like a protective cloak or something, you know, through all of this dangerous territory and terrain and monsters and horrible things, that it just allows us this protection, that you know, that there's this love. And how did you manage that? I mean, you know, through all of the difficulties that this character has to go through, all the characters have to go through, how did you manage to inject this love in there?
Actually, funnily enough, the love was the backbone of the book, and everything else were the ribs that hung off it, or the things that challenged the love. And, you know, I often think that love isn't, why would I write about love if love wasn't always in conflict, or it was always sort of threatened? And I knew when I was writing the book that I wanted to write a very specific type of love, and that's the unconditional, unquestioning, tenacious love that children have for flawed parents. It's quite a remarkable type of love that Shuggie has for his mother, because he really takes a lot of lickings in the book, or a lot of setbacks, and he keeps getting up, and he adores this woman more than anything else, and more than even his older brother thinks is good for him, you know. But love for me was the reason for writing the book. Everyone sort of comments on the themes that are covered in the book, whether it's sectarianism or homophobia or misogyny, and actually the themes were, I couldn't set a book in 1970s, 1980s Scotland without touching on those themes. But really, that wasn't why I wrote the book. Those were just, that was the tapestry that sat behind the characters. The reason why I wrote the book was because it's about these two souls clinging together in this tough time. And so the love wasn't hard to write. It was the other things that keep interfering with that love. Excuse me.
I was wondering, I remember I was looking through my notes that I write on books. I know some people find that sacrilegious, but I love writing on books with pencil. Okay, before I get hate mail. I made a note around, it was around page 200 roughly, and I was saying, where's Shuggie? I mean, Shuggie, where is he? Because most of this book, I felt this was Agnes's book. Why is this not called Agnes Bain? You know, because I felt like it was her book, and so I sort of then when I did the end, I sort of thought this felt like we were setting up Shuggie. This was part one. And this was going to be some sort of trilogy, because, you know, partly because I thought it'd taken quite a while to get Shuggie launched into his storyline, but it just did feel like that this was some sort of really lengthy Dickensian sort of dynasty book that we were going to get more of. And am I really away? Am I off piece here, or am I close to the truth?
You know, I asked that a lot. I think the book, what I wanted to do was, it's about two characters, and one is the end of Agnes and the beginning of Shuggie. And that's how the book sort of dovetails together. And that's a comment for me on intergenerational poverty. You know, I didn't want it to be a huge surprise that Agnes struggles in the book. I didn't want that to be the thing we were building to. So we open with Shuggie. Where is his mother? Where is this woman? And, you know, even when parents can't transcend the tough times that are around them, whether it's poverty or addiction or misogyny, then they still always hope for better for their kids. I think that's one of the reasons for life. And so Shuggie is the splinter of hope that comes off of Agnes. You know, she loves him and she hopes for better. And so he is, by calling it Shuggie and also by focusing on him in that way, I wanted that to remind the reader of the hope of the story, as opposed to the tragedy of the story, which is Agnes, because they're two characters that are achieving different things. But I asked a lot if we're going to come back and visit Shuggie again, and I don't know yet. I don't actually know. My next novel, I know, doesn't focus on Shuggie, but it broadens the themes that he faces. But who knows? I mean, maybe.
I think so, but I mean, who am I to say? I just to go back and tell you a little bit about this feeling that I had, that I was immersed in your story, and I wanted the same reaction when I wrote my novel, and how I did that was kept it in one view, so that this character was like a kind of a camera, yeah. So everything was seen through. So there was sort of like, you felt that you were him, and that immersed you in his world. But you actually immersed, because I was trying to think, how did you do this? But you actually did it through you had a very different way of doing that, of achieving that same effect. Tell us a little bit how you got that immersive effect for the reader.
Yeah, there was a couple of reasons why I did that. First of all, I felt like some of the themes that I touched on were far too complex for a 7 or 8 year old boy to comprehend. And I didn't want to take the reader and make him look at addiction or something else just from this one camera lens. I had also known that addiction, especially as a primary theme, affected so many people, not just the addict at the center or her son, but everybody around them. And so I wanted to reflect that, how Agnes affects her mother's and father's dreams for her, how her mother and father growing up in 1930s Britain see her addiction as like a failing of her will and not, they have no ability to see it as a mental health thing or some kind of sadness within Agnes. They just think she can sort herself out. But I wanted to look at it all the way across. And also, it was a time in Glasgow where not just this one single family was struggling, but so many people were having a tough time. I mean, unemployment was 26% in the city, and it stayed there for a long time. When that happens, really dark things like slide into society. And that's just the truth of it. But I also felt like enlisting a chorus of characters. First of all, that's the joy of writing a working class novel for me, because so many people go through the same thing at the same time. There's a solidarity to it. And so you can have those people tell you almost like a Greek chorus. But also it gave me much more bravery because I felt like I could shift some of the pressure onto them for not flinching, where if I'd have written it perhaps just from Shuggie's point of view, I would have flinched a little bit more, or thought, how could this boy possibly know this? Or how can this one boy say all of this? Whereas if I just took Shuggie out of it at times, I could be more unflinching.
The other thing I had noticed about, which I thought was incredibly well observed and added to my theory that this was sort of autobiographical at times, was that my father was an alcoholic, and one of the big impacts I noticed was the vigilance. That we knew by just how his key entered the lock, or even by the first foot on the stair, whether we were in danger.
Yeah.
And it's only something, I think, if you've gone through a parent with addiction or an alcoholism, and who's violent particularly as well, that you can observe something that's just that specific, and you do that really. Your powers of observation are really powerful in there, and I just wondered, in this story, you use that to your great effect, I think, and I just wondered, was that something did you sit down and think, okay, this is what I experienced through growing up like that, and I'm going to bring it into the story? Or was it much more of an organic process just when you were writing?
I did draw on an awful lot of my own experience, and it's, you're absolutely right. And I know you've lived through a similar thing, Paul. And actually, funnily enough, so many people do. One of the things that Shuggie has illuminated for me is the universality of that situation. And there's a shame and a stigma to addiction where we keep it at home. And so we oftentimes think we're one of the few people that goes through it. And actually, it's much more pervasive than we would think, especially of that time, I think. But I had always known that there's a watchfulness that comes with an addict as a parent. These children, and not just myself, but everybody that went through it, sort of is always watching the weather in a room. Because part of the problem is as a child, you internalize, or you believe that your parents' addiction is somehow rooted in you, that you are a cause for it, or I did anyway. Whereas if I could be quieter or brighter or funnier or less of a burden, then maybe it would alter how my mother felt about her alcoholism, or whether she would drink less or something. And so you're always kind of watching this other person and trying to anticipate what it is they might need and then adjusting yourself for it. Obviously, as an adult, I realized that my mother's addiction had nothing to do with me, or very little to do with me, and I was powerless to it. And Shuggie doesn't realize that in the book, though, as children often don't. And so he thinks he has some kind of power to be able to affect the outcome of it, but really he doesn't. But he's forever watching the room and the weather coming into the house. And that's just the way I remember my childhood being.
And another real truth that came out, and was very powerful for me, was the depiction of these Glaswegian women. Because I just recognized that from my mum, from the women in my street, and you had these sort of incredibly fierce warriors, resilient. They could take beatings, they could take the distrust and dislike and the hatred from men and from from the man that's supposed to love them the most, their husband, and and from their best friends. The women themselves were just constant, like hyenas at themselves, each other, but yet we're that pack that no one else could get into or threaten. And I remember thinking that my mom was addicted. My father was the alcoholic, but my mom had the addiction. My mom's addiction was my father.
Mm.
She literally could not see a life without him. And given all her fierceness, all her resilience, all her warrior, the man controlled her every thought and desire and to please him. And when I saw these women in your book and I watched them, I was so aware of that. And you think, what was that? What was that? How could they be that and then be such the opposite with these men? I mean, did you ever think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Shuggie, in terms of Scottish literature, is a foothill at the base of some real giants. I think about Irvine Welsh, I think about James Kelman, Alistair Gray, but they always focus on the man on the post-industrial landscape. But my entire world as a young queer boy, because I was rejected by men, was women. And so for me, Glasgow, although it's a masculine city, was a city of women, and it was a city of their strength. But women were formed by, or informed or shaped by everything that was going on around them, because although they had enormous power in some sense, they had really limited power in other senses, because either their husband controlled everything, or even the perception of, one of the things that Agnes goes through in the book is some of the women feel nervous about her because they want to know where her man is. Where's your man? Like, where is your man? And she's a powerful character that can probably look after herself, but they still feel very unsettled about what is this mother doing in the world without a man to back her up. And so I just wanted to show that world of women for all its complexity, but even some women are some of the worst villains in the book, and how they pull at each other and tear each other apart, because misogyny, and especially when it's passed through the filter of, in this instance, Catholic Church, can really affect everybody and can bring sexism down, so that women are also perpetrators of sexism, and use it against other women. And I had also known that to be the truth. But you're right, it's such a strange time that even though the book focuses on women, the men are always just slightly in the background, informing everything that happens to them.
Yeah, and what's something I wanted to ask you about, because I'm aware that quite often in literature festivals you get a lot of writers who come along because they, obviously it's their business or their dream. And I just want to talk a wee bit. I know we touched on it earlier on about your road to publication, because you had this. First of all, quickly, the seeds of the writer, even when you were younger, or while you were working in fashion or textile manufacturing things. I mean, was that little seed growing, tiny, and you were keeping it dark and not watering it or something? Or were you always doing a bit of writing, so to speak, about? And then when you had written this book, and you said it, 10 years, and you were written for yourself, that jump then from having written this thing for yourself to sending it out and having the response that it did initially, that must have been hard to deal with, and then having this massive success. So it would just be great to hear a little bit about that journey, because it's quite inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope I can give it to you in a clear way. But yeah, I hadn't always been writing, Paul. I'd been writing scraps here and there, but fashion at least allowed me an ability for storytelling, because you're still telling a story and creating a world, even if it's through visual media. You're really focused on detail and texture and what every little shift in something means. And so creatively, I was still telling stories and creating worlds and allowing people that would come into it to travel places they'd never been through a visual media. But I had been writing just little bits here and there. And when I sat down in 2008, I wouldn't allow myself to believe I was going to write a book. I wouldn't admit it to myself. What I began by doing was just writing the scenes or the chapters that came at me. And at first, I felt incredibly inadequate, because I was trying to be as I imagined a writer would be, or write as the people I admired wrote. And instead, it took me about 6 months to realize you just have to do this however it's strongest for you. And so I really relied on my visual background and my upbringing and my skills to create this world. And that's why I think the scenes are quite filmic or immersive, and the reader can sort of step into them, because I just used what I had in my toolbox. And when I started to do that, it started to come quicker. But the book actually began at the heart of the book, the scene with Shuggie and Leek walking over the sea of slag. And then it went to the end of the book and then back to the beginning. And the whole time it was really about just creating the world and building the world building in that way. And rather than placing any expectations on what this finished thing would be. But over the years, over the 10 years, I work on the book and I work on subsequent drafts. The first draft actually was 1,600 pages, or 900 pages single-spaced. It would have been a real monster. And a lot of it had to be thrown out because it wasn't very good. A lot of it had to be honed. And, I enjoyed just learning my craft in that way. But this isn't a weirdly sort of dismissive thing when I say this, but the important thing for me was writing the book. The whole time I was writing, I had no notion or need for it to be published. And in fact, I felt if I told my friends, they'd be like, who the hell do you think you are to write a book, Also living in New York, people say that kind of thing all the time, right? And you always think to yourself, okay, good luck, you're writing a book, okay. And so I had internalized that, and instead I thought, I'm just going to write a book and not tell anyone. And so when the book gets to about its 10-year point, actually, I put it away for a little bit in between it, and I start working on my next novel. And, I go back and I revise it and I think about it some more. And I can't quite say goodbye to the characters because they're incredibly personal to me. But when it reaches the 10-year mark, I think to myself, I have to do something with this, because it was hindering not only my creative life, but actually my life. It was just there, and it had to go out into the world. And so I did what any writer does, I queried an agent, I got an agent, and my agent then sent the book out for submission. And very quickly, she said to me, do you want to know when it's rejected? And me, being incredibly naive, was like, yeah, I do. I'll learn something. That'll be fascinating. And actually never say that if you're a debut novelist, because you can do nothing with it and it does you no good. But the book was rejected really quickly 20 times. And actually my agent then confessed that she stopped telling me after 20 times. It was rejected 44 times in total on both sides of the Atlantic, but primarily in America. But the thing that was interesting that I didn't realize at the time is, first of all, rejection's a part of a writer's life, and we have to be okay with it, and we have to believe in our art enough not to be thrown off course by it. But also, rejection's important because you're trying to find your hero. A lot of reasons why Shuggie was rejected is because editors didn't know how to bring the book into the world. They didn't know how to launch a debut novelist's voice in that way and talk about addiction in Glasgow. Where is Glasgow? A lot of people were sort of thinking about that in New York. And so what really happened is I received one offer from Grove Atlantic, and they were the heroes for Shuggie. They believed in it as much as I did, Paul. And everything that follows from there follows because they truly believed in the book.
Brilliant. And unfortunately, time's up. I could talk to you all day. I hope we get the opportunity to do that one time. Maybe we're in Belfast or I'm over in New York. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And best of luck to Shuggie and the new novel.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me today, Paul. And I can't wait to see you in Jaipur in real life.
Thank you, Douglas Stuart and Paul McVeigh, for this compelling discussion. Through heartbreak comes courage and love, we hope. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Do stay tuned in with us and continue to watch the amazing sessions that we have specially curated for you.